As a member of the board of MAS, it gives me great pleasure to link two great thinkers about design. We've just heard Amanda Burden detail her vision of how to make a wonderful city, and we see it unfolding before our eyes. And now we're going to welcome Witold Brzezinski, a colleague of mine at the University of Pennsylvania, where he holds the Marjorie and Martin Meyerson Chair of Urbanism, and an extraordinary thinker about all kinds of design. Books on the screw, books on large-scale development in the suburbs, trying to make new urbanism work in the suburbs, books on city life, books on the house. His most recent book, The Makeshift Metropolis, Ideas About Cities, came out last year, and in a few minutes we're going to see yet another one, The Biography of a Building, How Robert Sainsbury and Norman Foster Built a Great Museum. It's going to be a lot of fun now to hear him reflect on the broader themes of design and have you link what you've just heard from Amanda Burden in terms of how she applies design, how he links this to the larger theories of design. So let's welcome Witold. Please come.
Thank you. There should be some slides up here. I agree with, thank you, and by the way, thank you, Jeannie, for that nice introduction. Thanks. I agree with Jane Jacobs that cities grow and develop piecemeal, generally. I don't completely agree with her feeling that that's the only way cities grow, because we do know that the City Beautiful movement had a tremendously positive impact on American cities. And before that, the idea of building big parks in cities was certainly a big idea that changed not just New York, but many cities across the continent. But I do think it's true that these are exceptions, that the big ideas come along once in a while. The last time they came along was in the 50s and 60s, and they were really bad, good, big ideas. Urban renewal, which devastated American cities, and I think is an important. Americans are so optimistic that they like to forget the bad things. But that was a really bad thing, and I think it's colored our sense of what city planning is, and we can certainly see how it's affected city planning that Amanda just spoke about, because we look at the details now. We realize that it has to work at the level of a person walking around in a city and not simply in terms of how it looks from the air. So I wanted to talk about a little bit things that we've learned in the 40 or 50 years since this debauch of urban renewal. And it has been, New York less than other American cities got on that bandwagon, but most American cities did. I think mayors go to conferences and they exchange formulas. And so when you get convention centers in cities, suddenly every city has a convention center. And I expect to see High Lines in many other cities. None of them will work as well as the New York High Line, but nevertheless, people have kind of gotten on, that's the next big idea. Many of the ideas come from New York, but not all, as we'll see. There are also ideas that other cities generate. It's the great danger of living in a very large country with many cities. The French don't have this problem. They only have one big city, one seriously big city. And so there aren't other cities that copy it because, there's only one Paris, and how could you have a competitive Paris? You couldn't. But we have many cities, and that's a big issue, and that we shouldn't forget that. We're a very, very large country with many, many large cities. Other than China, I can't think of too many countries which have so many large cities. So it's not only about the metropolis, it's about all of these cities. How does this thing work? Okay. Some of the ideas, the kind of piecemeal ideas that we've learned about in the last 30 or 40 years of essentially putting our cities back together, One is that we infill rather than replace large parts of the city. That infilling at a very small scale works much better than simply starting over. Starting over is very attractive because it's a sense that we can solve all the problems by sort of clear-cutting and urbanistically and doing something new. But as Jane Jacobs pointed out, that's really not the way cities grow. And also it's putting much too much faith in planners and architects that they actually have the answers. Whereas if we develop infill in a piecemeal way, we can make mistakes. And we will make mistakes, but they'll be small mistakes. And we can sort of back off them if we see that we're taking the wrong direction. It's easy to forget this, and as I said, New York was probably one of the cities that didn't jump on this bandwagon. But in the 50s and 60s, streets were considered bad. They were dangerous. You had cars and people. You couldn't mix cars and people. And so we got into this idea of making superblock projects which eliminated streets, or closing streets down and keeping cars out of them, or maybe allowing buses only, but making these pedestrian zones. It worked in Europe. It's never worked very well in America. Outside of college towns, because college students don't have cars and they have lots of time on their hands, and so they populate closed streets. And so there are malls that work, but they're in places like Boulder and Burlington, Vermont, and college towns. But in big cities, they've never worked. And there have been hundreds of these pedestrian malls that have been reopened to cities to traffic, because we know that, and New York knows that very well, that cars and people do coexist, and that these busy streets are essentially the lifeline of the city. Ed Glazer has written an interesting book recently about city planning and cities, and his point was that cities are all about people making contact. That's really the only raison d'etre for cities. It's not about big architecture, it's not about parks, it's really only about how can people meet other people. And that's what has made cities, he claims, the greatest invention of human civilization. And streets are a terrific way to meet people. They're a much better way than subways and various other things, just sidewalks and streets and the life that goes on in the street. So we've rediscovered that. And an example, for instance, the World Trade Center has put back streets where the original World Trade Center closed streets, and that was considered a good thing. We realized that you don't have to reinvent the street. The street is a wonderful invention. It's been around for thousands of years, and it works. We have to know when to use the right street in the right place and how to design, as we've seen, the details of the street. But it's still a great way of making cities function. Density, New York is, of course, the densest city, among the densest cities in the country. Density is very important in cities because how can you meet people if you're spread out? So the denser a city is, the better a city functions as a city. And again, it wasn't something that we believed all the time. And there was a moment when we felt cities had gotten too dense, and it was probably a kind of inheritance from the industrial period when cities, you had overcrowding in housing, and you really did have too many people, at least on a person per square foot basis. But we've sort of come full circle and realized the more you can build up the density, all things being equal, the better the city is going to function. Parks seem kind of obvious, but if you were to read a planning book from the 50s or 60s, they don't mention parks. Parks were considered a Victorian leftover. They were like gazebos or those quaint bandstands that you would see in a park. Everybody looked at them. There were no bands to play in them, and they were kind of antiques. And New York, to its enormous credit, never, not much anyway, took out parts of the parks. Brooklyn, not at all. Prospect Park, Central Park a little bit. There's a little too much intrusion with the museums and various things. But you didn't build a golf course there, or you didn't build a dumping ground for the maintenance department of the city, all of which has happened in other Olmsted parks in other cities. So the Olmsted parks were these huge chunks of land that were just owned by the city, which were just, there was just the temptation to use them for other things was just too big, and we started shoving zoos into them and all sorts of non-park uses. So for a long time, parks were really not part of the city. They were just leftovers. And I think this, partly caused by the restoration of Central Park, we rediscovered parks. And it also has to do that we changed. This is not a vindication of Olmsted's idea, because Olmsted was not an environmentalist. He saw parks very differently than the way we use them today. And so it has a lot to do with Americans themselves changing, and this awareness of the environment, this interest in the natural environment, the interest in physical well-being, jogging, all those things that take place in parks. So it's really a confluence of the parks being there from the Victorian period, and then a culture which suddenly rediscovers all these pleasures and invents new pleasures. The variety of things in Brooklyn Bridge Park is astounding. You don't find that in the old parks. And so parks have become a big part of cities, and new parks are cropping up in virtually every American city. Major city is building parks. Not as big as the Olmsted parks, because land is just too expensive, but large chunks of parks. And this is only in the last couple of decades. So I don't believe that parks are a way of sort of to recreate urbanism. It's not a new kind of urbanism, but it's an ingredient of a city that has become very important. I mean, peripheral, but sort of by the way, the other ingredient of being a successful city is having a place to go mountain climbing not too far away. You don't have that. You have Long Island, which is really kind of a big suburb. But if you're a Denver or a Seattle, one of the attractions of urban life, which would not have seemed urban at all 100 years ago, is to have wilderness within a few hours' drive. And that's what makes those cities newly kind of attractive to people. So culture changes, and it has effects on cities. New York, as we heard, has a lot of water line, which turns out to be very good. It doesn't have an enormous amount of snow. It's not Buffalo, which is also good, because for some reason, and I speak as an old Canadian, we've got a real revulsion to snow. I mean, our great-grandparents lived with snow perfectly reasonably, and yet we can't. And so a city which has a lot of snow is out of luck, I'm afraid. Water is another very interesting thing, because water was, of course, an industrial part of the city. Virtually every American city, except a few in Texas, is built on the water, in either a lake or a river or a seacoast. But it was an industrial part of the city. It wasn't like the Seine or the Thames that went through the city, and the Londoners and Parisians have been enjoying those waterfronts for several hundred years, purely as a leisure space. Our water was different, and this rediscovery or discovery of Americans that waterfronts could be attractive leisure places is really something very new. And as I said, most American cities have waterfronts, so that it's easy to start converting them, especially since container shipping has moved ports out of cities anyway, and so the old ports are no longer needed. And even cities like Dallas that don't really have water have created waterfronts. They've taken rivers and built parks around them and sort of reinforced them. It also makes sense, if you think about it, that if you have the suburbs and the city, what does the city have to offer? Well, it has the density, but there aren't many suburbs on the water, and there aren't many suburbs full of historic buildings. So historic buildings and water are a unique attribute of most American cities, waterfronts. If we built our cities to resemble the suburbs, which we tried to do in the 70s, we put malls in the cities and all sorts of things, it didn't work, because the cities can never compete directly with the suburbs on suburban values. They have more land, they have more parking spaces, but they don't have waterfronts. And because people have suddenly drawn to waterfronts, it's an enormous advantage that American cities have. Shopping, we are an entrepreneurial society, and shopping is terrifically important. And again, we've rediscovered that, because if you look at the plans of the 60s, it was all about housing, and there was just housing. Those huge, enormous housing projects didn't have one store in them, because that was not what they were about. They were about residential. Or you got cultural centers, and you only had culture in them. You wouldn't have anything else. Or you got sports places, which was just these huge stadiums and nothing else. But we shop all the time, and it's not a bad thing. If you think about the bazaar or the marketplace, I mean, cities have always been about shopping as a social activity, as wandering around, bumping into people, seeing what's in the market, learning from people. That's what cities have been about. So shopping has always, in many cities, been a very important part of urban life, if you define shopping sort of in the broadest possible sense. And I think we've learned that lesson, and so even urban campuses have realized that you could have a campus building, but why not stick a few shops in the bottom? It's better on the street than having just a blank wall or a room with students playing with computers. It doesn't enliven a street, whereas shops create traffic, and it's lively, and shop owners do their best to make it lively. So shops are an integral part, I think, of design in a city. Mixed use, we've probably gone over the hill on mixed use a bit. Everything is mixed use, as if it were kind of a magic bullet. Well, it isn't, and it's very hard to do good mixed use, but it is true that mixing functions, while complicated and expensive, creates a livelier city. And it requires more expensive buildings, it requires different sorts of zoning. I mean, it requires changes, because we tended to want to separate things. And zoning, as we saw with that colored drawing, was about putting, this is a commercial street and this is a residential street, and never the two shall meet. I think we've learned that in big cities they should meet, and they should meet quite a lot. History, I don't mean here about historic preservation. That's a whole separate issue of preserving our heritage and so on. But rather the idea that cities that have old and new things in them are more interesting places. And the old things may be important old things, or they just might be old things. They're not necessarily great monuments of the past, but having the past as well as the present is very important to a city. And the dream of architects and planners was to make cities that were completely new. And it looked good on paper, but we know from experience that very large environments that have nothing from the past are sterile, even if they're quite beautiful in many ways. They just don't have the layers of history, and they don't have the reminders of the past. Never mind the economic issue that old buildings tend to be cheaper than new buildings, so they can support different kinds of economic activities. So I think more developers rather than citizens that rediscovered this, and they started saving buildings, not because they cared so much about history, but rather they realized that people like to see bits of old brick walls and loft-type buildings where you see the old beams and structure and so on. In some cases, of course, that some of the history is artificial, but I mean, if you don't have it, it's still, you want to recreate it. And it's a kind of false history in a way, but that's kind of snobbish. You happen to live in a very old city, so you have lots of old buildings. If you live in a new city, you don't. So you may have to recreate them in some way. So I have seen loft housing in new cities that's brand new. They're not industrial buildings, they're brand new buildings, but it allows somebody in Minneapolis or somewhere to live in a loft building because they read about New Yorkers doing that. So what would come next? I started by saying that it's a very large country, so that the danger is that we see something that works in one place and we say, well, that's the answer. That's what we have to do in other places. New Yorkers were resistant to that, I think partly because you're sort of snobs. You think you're the biggest city in the country. You don't need to copy anybody. And it turned out to be a good thing in the 60s because I don't believe you closed any major streets. Chicago did, Philadelphia did. Those are all reopened since, but I don't think New York did that. But certainly people look to New York, and if something works in New York, it tends to migrate to the rest of the country. Incidentally, waterfronts really started in San Francisco. Fisherman's Wharf was one of the first places that realized if you had old buildings, not historic, just old buildings and a waterfront, that was a formula for commercial success. And the very first projects in the Fisherman's Wharf area really, and this we're talking about, I think, the late 60s, maybe even a bit earlier than that, discovered that and created then something which other cities could learn from and other cities followed. So the danger, I think, is to look for formulas. I think it's much more important, as Amanda said, to actually study situations and to look at details and try to figure things out, what actually works for us. I don't think putting lawn chairs in the middle of the streets is going to work in a lot of American cities. But in this city it works because it's so dense and nobody has even a balcony to sit on. And so people will go on the street. So it makes sense here, but it might not make sense in other places, and vice versa. So this piecemeal approach is less dramatic, and it requires sort of more work in a way, because you can't simply apply big ideas. But in the end, I think it's much more successful. Thank you.
I'm told we have a few minutes, and I would think it'd be nice if Amanda came up as well, and we could have questions. And I'll let you moderate.
Okay.
Neither of you mentioned mass transit and the importance of mass transit to the city and how it is planned and grows, and I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
I can.
Obviously, mass transit is critical to a sustainable city, and we're very fortunate to have a dense mass transit system, actually a pretty extensive mass transit system, and the tradition of dense mixed-use neighborhoods. Building a mass transit system underground is very expensive and complicated. We don't have a federal government that nurtures the development of mass transit, growth of mass transit in cities. We are obviously building a Second Avenue subway, which is taking its time. But for the first time, we have actually, the city is actually paying itself for the extension of the number 7 subway line, which is actually critical to the growth of the West Side. And as you know, Midtown here is built out completely. There's not a single vacant site here for corporate headquarters. So the extension of the number 7 line, which will be complete in 2013, will secure New York City's future by being able to go to the Hudson River. Jeanette Sadikan has done an extraordinary job of actually having alternative modes of public transit by beginning what she calls the express bus service, which is bus rapid transit, the way sort of a New York adaptation of that, where you pay for your ticket before getting on the bus. The key to all of this, and I'm glad you brought it up, which is if we're going to have a city that's really sustainable, that means we're not going to rob resources now from future generations, is to have better mobility. And that means not only by public transit, but it also means by bike lanes, which is a cheap way of having cheap mobility, and very importantly also many alternatives to the automobile. So the expansion of car share, which we legalized in all garages around the city, are, again, it's not public transit, but again, it's alternative mode to owning and using a car. So I think public transit is how New York City has to develop. We're going to grow by 1 million people. And if we don't have alternatives to the car, then we're a city that can't grow in the right way and with cleaner air and a better life for New Yorkers. So hopefully that answers the question. I don't know if you had some comments on that?
Transportation is a key thing in the history of cities. So when you walk, you're limited, and so the cities Ancient Rome, for instance, was quite dense, vertical. I mean, they didn't have elevators, so it was about 6 floors, but it was a dense city. Once you get horses, you can go further. Horses are a problem because they're dangerous. They kick people. They take horses and carriages take a lot of space. And I recently saw drawings of a sort of multi-story, in effect, parking garage for horses and carriages. But it needed huge radius ramps. It was an awkward thing. So if you think cars are bad, horses and carriages were difficult too. And so cities change in response to that. And then you have the omnibus, and then eventually streetcars, and eventually automobiles. So it's not, I don't think it's a sort of simple thing to say a city has to have mass transit. I think a city has, there are different cities and people get around differently. And clearly in LA, say in the 1920s, the car is what created that city. Initially the streetcar and eventually the automobile, but they were both very spread out. So you got a city that was about 100 miles long, which was unprecedented for American cities. So I think it's important to look at it in that sense, that the way we get around forms the city, but we get around in so many different ways. And we do change. I think if we had suggested bicycles 25 years ago, it would have been sort of ridiculous because only kids rode bicycles in the United States. I mean, adults didn't ride bicycles. And the idea that a businessman would ride a bicycle or a businesswoman to work would have been ridiculed. But we've changed. So bicycles have sort of become an option, which they certainly weren't socially, I think, in the past. So the picture keeps changing.
We would love to have more questions, but the time is marching on. I hope you really appreciate what you've just seen. You've had theory and practice, and you've seen them all expressed. It's just been marvelous. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Both of you.